Imagine walking into a well-known bank in downtown Chicago, only to be treated like you don't belong. They questioned her identity, scrutinized her ID, and even called securityall before realizing they were about to deny service to the very person who had built this institution from the ground up. This wasn't just any customer. This was Victoria Lawson, the founder and CEO of Lawson Financial Group, a bank she had believed was different, fair, inclusive, and built on trust. But was it really? Have you ever been judged unfairly based on appearance? Let us know in the comments. Your story matters. That question had been nagging at Victoria for months. She had heard murmur stories of certain customers being treated differently at specific branches. It was nothing blatant, nothing that made headlines, but enough to make her wonder. Her institution had strict policies against discrimination, but policies were just words on paper. Real change required action. So, today, she wasn't walking into her bank as the CEO. She was walking in as just another customer. No power suit, no expensive jewelry, no signs of wealth. Just jeans, a cardigan, and sneakers. She tied her hair into a simple ponytail, grabbed her worn-out leather bag, and took a deep breath before stepping out of her car. She had chosen this branch Deliberatilia location she had personally approved 3 years prior in a bustling, diverse neighborhood known for its economic growth and cultural vibrancy. She had been here for the grand opening, shaking hands, cutting the ribbon, and speaking passionately about the importance of financial accessibility. At that time, she had stood proudly beside the branch manager, talking about Lawson Financial Group's mission to serve everyone with fairness and dignity. But as time passed, she began hearing murmur stories of certain customers receiving a very different experience. Now, she wasn't a CEO on a press tour. She wasn't a leader giving motivational speeches. She was a woman, an ordinary customer, about to put her own institution to the test. Would she be treated the way she expected every customer to be treated? Or would she experience what so many others had hinted at but never formally reported? As she walked toward the entrance, she glanced at the large glass windows, catching her own reflection. No one would recognize her like this, she thought. And that was exactly what she wanted. She stepped inside. The cool rush of air conditioning greeted her, along with the faint scent of printer ink and freshly sanitized counters. The lobby was quiet, a few customers scattered across the waiting area, some filling out forms, others chatting casually with tellers. Everything looked normal, but would it feel normal? She squared her shoulders and walked up to the counter, ready to find out. The teller, a woman in her mid-20s with dark hair pulled into a ponytail, barely looked up. No greeting, no smile, not even a basic acknowledgement of Victoria's presence. Instead, with a lazy flick of her wrist, she slid a clipboard across the counter. "Fill this out." Victoria hesitated for just a moment, taking in the teller's dismissive attitude. This was the kind of indifference she had spent years trying to erase from the banking industry. She had built her institution with the belief that every customer, regardless of their background, should be treated with dignity and respect. But as she stood there, feeling the weight of the teller's cold glance, she couldn't help but wonder had her vision truly reached every corner of her own bank? Had she been too optimistic in thinking she had changed an industry that had long thrived on bias and exclusion? She had been in countless banks, spoken at major financial conferences, and worked tirelessly to build an institution where every customer mattered. And yet, here she was being treated like an afterthought. Swallowing her irritation, she took the clipboard and filled in her account details, along with the withdrawal amount $5,000. It wasn't an extravagant sum by any means. It was nowhere near the kind of transaction that should raise eyebrows. She had personally approved withdrawal policies, and she knew for a fact that this was a standard request. So why did she suddenly feel like she was being examined under a microscope? She handed the form back, watching the teller closely. And then, everything changed. The moment the teller's eyes skimmed over the information, her entire demeanor shifted. Her lips pressed into a thin line, her brows pinched together slightly, and there was a hesitation, one that Victoria had seen before. The kind that wasn't about policies or procedures, but about something deeper, something unspoken. A flicker of doubt, a silent question. Does she belong here? Victoria remained calm, keeping her posture steady as she observed the subtle change. The teller didn't say anything at first. Instead, her fingers hovered over the keyboard like she was debating whether to proceed at all. Then, as if making a quiet decision, she slowly placed the ID back on the counter without taking the next step in the transaction. Victoria's stomach tightened. She had come here expecting to be treated like any other customer, but now she was experiencing firsthand what others had hinted at for so long. This wasn't about security. This wasn't about policy. This was about perception. The teller's demeanor shifted almost imperceptibly at first. Her eyes flicked between the ID and Victoria, her lips pressing into a thin line. There was a hesitation, subtle yet unmistakable, a moment that stretched just a fraction too long. And in that pause, Victoria knew this wasn't about policy. This wasn't about procedure. This was about perception, about the way people silently judge based on appearance, mannerisms, or some preconceived notion of who should or shouldn't belong in certain spaces. The air in the room felt heavier now. The teller glanced at Victoria once more, her expression guarded, as if debating whether to say something. Instead, she simply pursed her lips, grabbed the ID with a careful hand, and murmured, "I'll be right back." She turned abruptly, disappearing into the manager's office without another word. Victoria exhaled, feeling a tightness settle in her chest. She tapped her fingers against the counter, steady and controlled, but beneath that measured rhythm was something else: frustration, maybe even anger. She had walked in expecting to be treated like any other customer. But now, she was being forced to reckon with the very biases she had worked so hard to eliminate from her institution. She scanned the room. A man in a pressed business suit stood near the entrance, chatting casually with another teller, his transaction being processed without delay. A woman in a floral dress sat comfortably in the waiting area, smiling as she exchanged pleasantries with a bank associate. No hesitations, no questions, just service. Victoria's gaze returned to the frosted glass door of the manager's office. She could only imagine what was happening behind it. Was Todd questioning the legitimacy of her account, trying to find an excuse to deny her request? Was he reinforcing the teller's hesitation, silently affirming that people like her didn't belong? Or was he simply stalling, hoping she would give up and leave? Whatever the case, Victoria knew one thing: this wasn't just a routine delay. This was something far more insidious, and she was determined to see how far it would go. She could feel it now, the weight of an unspoken assumption pressing down on her. It wasn't a matter of security or even protocol. This was something deeper, something systemic, and she had a feeling this was only the beginning. As she waited, she observed the room, her eyes carefully taking in the interactions happening around her. A man in a crisp business suit received an immediate greeting from a smiling teller, who asked how his day was going before swiftly processing his transaction. He barely had to lift a finger, no extra questions, no scrutiny, no delays. Just efficiency and courtesy. Across the lobby, another customary woman in a floral dress chatted easily with a different teller. They exchanged a few friendly remarks, their conversation light and effortless, as if they were old acquaintances. The woman handed over a check, and within seconds, the teller was processing her request. No second glances, no hesitation. Just seamless service, the kind Victoria had envisioned for every customer at her bank. And yet, here she was standing at the counter, treated like an outsider in the very institution she built. A few more minutes passed. The teller had vanished into the back office, leaving Victoria with nothing but the growing realization that this was about something deeper than policy. It was about perception. Then, finally, the manager emerged. Todd Benson, middle-aged, bald, rimless glasses perched on his nose. His posture was composed, but there was something about the way he approached that felt too calculated, too rehearsed. A polite mask, concealing the fact that he had already made up his mind before even speaking to her. "Afternoon, ma'am." He greeted, his tone neutral but distant. "I understand you're trying to make a withdrawal." Victoria nodded, keeping her voice steady. "That's right. $5,000. My account. My ID." Todd took her ID from the counter, his fingers grazing over it, as if he expected something to be off. He held it up to the light, turned it over, examined every corner with a meticulousness that was unnecessary. Then came the carefully phrased question. Is this your first time banking with us? Victoria's patience wavered. She kept her expression neutral, but internally, she bristled at the implication. I've banked here since the branch opened, she replied smoothly, watching for any reaction. A pause. A flicker of something unreadable crossed Todd's face. Then, slowly, he placed the ID back on the counter. Unfortunately, we're unable to process this withdrawal at this time. Victoria's jaw tightened. Excuse me? Todd clasped his hands together, maintaining his carefully measured tone. It's just a precaution. We take security very seriously. There it was. That word again. Security. A word often used to justify exclusion, to create invisible barriers, to make certain people feel like they didn't belong. Victoria inhaled deeply, steadying herself. Would you be asking these questions if I were a man in a tailored suit? Todd's polished composure faltered, just for a second, before he quickly masked it. This isn't about appearance, he said, his voice smooth but unconvincing. It's about policy. Victoria arched a brow, letting the silence stretch, daring him to believe his own words. She had spent years crafting the policies of this bank, and she knew for a fact that none of them justified what was happening now. Then Todd did something that turned this from frustrating to infuriating. He pressed a discreet button beneath the counter, and within moments, security appeared. Todd examined the ID as if expecting it to dissolve in his hands. Then came the carefully phrased question. Is this your first time banking with us? Victoria felt her patience thin. I've banked here since the branch opened. More hesitation. Then, Todd placed the ID back on the counter. Unfortunately, we're unable to process this withdrawal at this time. Victoria's jaw tightened. Excuse me? It's just a precaution. We take security very seriously. Security. That word again. A word that masked the real issue. Would you be asking these questions if I were a man in a tailored suit? Todd's mask slipped for just a second before he composed himself. This isn't about appearance. It's about policy. Then Todd did something that turned this from frustrating to infuriating. He pressed a discreet button beneath the counter, his fingers barely moving, but Victoria caught the motion immediately. A moment later, the door to the side office swung open, and a uniformed security guard stepped out, his gaze sweeping the room before landing on her. The guard was tall, broad-shouldered, and carried himself with the kind of authority that made people instinctively step aside. His expression was neutral, but Victoria knew the drill security wasn't summoned unless someone was deemed a problem. And right now, Todd had just decided that she was the problem. The guard stepped forward, his voice firm but professional. Is there a problem here? Victoria let the question linger for a moment, then gave a slow, deliberate smile. That depends, she said smoothly. Are you here to help me access my money, or just to escort me out? The guard hesitated, his gaze shifting between her and Todd, as if trying to assess the situation. He hadn't been briefed on detail, she had simply been called in as reinforcement. But Victoria could see it in his stance. Even he wasn't sure why exactly he had been summoned. That made two of them. Todd remained silent, his jaw tightening slightly, but the damage had already been done. He had escalated the situation, turned a simple transaction into a confrontation, and now there was no easy way to back out. Victoria could feel the weight of the room shifting, the energy changing. Customers nearby had begun to take notice, their subtle glances turning into outright stares. A hushed silence settled over the lobby, the kind that happens when people sense something uncomfortable unfolding but aren't sure whether they should intervene. Todd's mistake wasn't just in pressing that button, it was in assuming she would back down. Victoria had spent years breaking barriers in a male-dominated industry, proving her worth time and time again. She had fought against skepticism, shattered glass ceilings, and built a bank from the ground up, only to find herself standing here, being told she didn't belong. But she had never been one to shrink under pressure. If Todd thought intimidation would make her walk away, he was about to learn a lesson he wouldn't forget. But Victoria wasn't going anywhere. And now, she was about to make him regret it. She pulled out her phone and started recording. "I just want to document this properly. You're refusing to give me access to my account despite having valid ID, while other customers are served without issue." Todd visibly tensed, but it was too late. Victoria reached for her ID and tapped it against the counter. A hush fell over the bank lobby. A few customers exchanged glances, whispering to one another. One man near the waiting area subtly pulled out his phone, angling it just enough to capture what was happening. A teller at the far end of the room shifted uncomfortably, pretending to be occupied with paperwork but clearly listening. The security guard, who had taken a half-step forward moments ago, now hesitated, his expression uncertain. Every eye in the room was on her, waiting, watching. And that was exactly what she wanted. "Let me introduce myself properly. I am Victoria Lawson, CEO and founder of Lawson Financial Group, and I built this bank." The silence was instant. Todd went pale. The teller looked like she wanted to disappear. The security guard awkwardly shifted on his feet. "If I looked the way you expected a CEO to look, we wouldn't be having this conversation." She slid a business card across the counter. "You'll be calling my office to schedule a meeting with corporate." And finally, she turned to the teller. "Maybe you should ask yourself why protocol only applies to people like me." As she walked out, she made one final statement. "This is the last time something like this happens in my bank." The fallout was swift. By the next morning, an emergency meeting was scheduled. Todd was gone. Corporate HR issued a formal review, reinforcing company policies against discrimination and implementing stricter oversight measures. Employees were required to undergo comprehensive bias training, ensuring that such incidents would be identified and addressed before they escalated. The message was clear: this wasn't just about one manager's mistake. It was about reshaping the culture of accountability within the company. Bias training was mandated. Accountability policies were overhauled. Customers, especially those who had been ignored before, noticed the change. And Victoria? She never forgot that day. In the weeks that followed, emails flooded her inbox, customers sharing their own experiences of bias, employees expressing their gratitude for her standing up to systemic issues they had witnessed but felt powerless to change. Some of them had been denied loans. Others had been made to feel less than simply because they didn't fit a certain profile. The incident became more than just a personal confrontation. It became a catalyst for broader reform within her bank. Victoria didn't just walk away from that moment, she carried it forward, using it to shape new initiatives aimed at ensuring that no customer would ever have to question whether they belonged. Because real change doesn't happen with words on a page. It happens when someone refuses to accept the status quo. Have you ever had an experience at a bank that left you feeling unheard or dismissed? Ever been dismissed because someone assumed you didn't belong? Share your story in the comments. Let's make these conversations matter. And if you believe in standing up for what's right, hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Because together, we can create change. Lessons and key takeaways from Victoria's story. Victoria's experience at the bank is more than just a personal battle. It is a reflection of the everyday struggles that many people face when they are unfairly judged based on appearance, assumptions, or systemic biases. This is a story that resonates deeply with many individuals who have felt unseen, unheard, or undervalued in spaces where they should have been treated equally. More than just a cautionary tale, Victoria's experience is a wake-up call, an urgent reminder that even in the most progressive institutions, unconscious bias and discrimination can thrive if left unchallenged. It is proof that words alone, no matter how well-intended, are not enough to dismantle deep-rooted inequities. Change requires action, courage, and accountability. Her story challenges us all to reflect. How many times have we witnessed unfair treatment and remained silent? How often have we second-guessed ourselves, wondering if what we experienced was real or just in our heads? How many people are denied fair service simply because they don't fit an expected mold? These are not just theoretical questions. They are the very foundation of why standing up against injustice matters. Here are some powerful lessons we can all learn from Victoria's story. 1. Perception shapes experience. The way we are perceived can dictate how we are treated. Victoria, despite being the CEO of the bank, was assumed to be someone who did not belong simply because she didn't match the stereotypical image of power and success. This reminds us that biases, whether conscious or unconscious, still play a major role in society. 2. Power lies in taking a stand. Had Victoria walked away, the cycle of discrimination in her own bank would have continued unchecked. Instead, she chose to challenge the injustice in the moment, proving that real change happens when we refuse to stay silent. 3. Institutional change requires accountability. Victoria didn't just address the issue with Todd. She took it as an opportunity to overhaul company policies, implement bias training, and ensure that discrimination would no longer go unnoticed. This demonstrates that true leadership isn't just about fixing an immediate problem, but about making structural changes that prevent it from happening again. 4. Every customer deserves equal treatment. Victoria's story highlights the disparities in customer service, how some people are greeted warmly while others are met with suspicion. Businesses and institutions must recognize and correct these disparities to foster an environment where all customers feel valued and respected. 5. Speak up, your voice matters. If Victoria had not spoken up, she might have left that bank feeling powerless. But by standing her ground, she not only reclaimed her authority, but also inspired others to share their experiences. This serves as a reminder that when we witness or experience injustice, speaking up could be the first step toward meaningful change. A message to our viewers. Have you ever been treated unfairly because of how you look, dress, or speak? Or perhaps you've witnessed someone else being judged unfairly. If you feel comfortable, we'd love to hear your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. Your voice can help bring awareness to these issues and inspire change. Let's continue these important conversations and push for a world where fairness, respect, and dignity are given to everyone equally. Every story matters, and together, we can make a difference. Subscribe to Toch Story for more powerful and thought-provoking stories that inspire change. If you found this story meaningful, consider liking the video and turning on notifications so you never miss an update.